U.S. Coast Guard is reportedly pursuing an oil tanker in international waters near Venezuela.
It is the second such operation over the weekend, and if successful, it would be the third interception of a ship in less than 2 weeks. The White House has yet to confirm the latest pursuit, but it comes as President Donald Trump doubles down on his campaign to stop sanctioned oil tankers from moving in and out of Venezuela.
The blockade is part of a pressure campaign against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's administration, which the White House has designated a foreign terrorist organization. Washington accuses him of being involved in the smuggling of fentanyl into the U.S. and has demanded he return assets seized from U.S. oil companies years ago. Venezuela has slammed the detention of oil tankers as, quote, theft and kidnapping, saying Trump's true intention is to control Venezuela's crude reserves.
And to pile the pressure on Caracas, the U.S. has amassed more than a dozen military assets in the region, including an aircraft carrier. It's also attacked dozens of alleged drug smuggling boats, killing more than 100 people. Mr. Trump has also not ruled out the possibility of a ground operation into Venezuela, a threat neighbouring Brazil says would result in a humanitarian catastrophe.
For more, we are joined by Ian Ralby. He's the CEO of IR Consilium. Thank you so much for joining us, Ian. From a maritime security perspective, why do you think Washington is stepping up enforcement now?
Well, it seems that the United States has gleaned that the best way to attack a country at this point in terms of its ability to project force or do almost anything is to cut off the supply of its lifeline. And the maritime space is where 90% of all goods move. It is the actual part of almost every country's global economy. And so if you cut that off, you cut off the ability of the state to act in other ways. And so this is a way of ensuring that the state is weakened and diminished because the funds that go into the coffers of Venezuela would be substantially reduced if it could not access the maritime marketplace.
Okay, so Ian, these vessels are described as part of a shadow fleet. Could you tell us what that actually means in practice? And given these pursuits are happening in international waters, where's the legal line between sanctions enforcement and interference with freedom of navigation?
Great question. The freedom of navigation allows for all ships flying any flag to move freely around the world. However, there are constraints. The shadow fleet is a colloquial term. It is not a legal term. It is not entirely clear in its nuanced definition. But effectively, what it refers to is a series of vessels that are using a lot of different techniques to move largely sanctioned oil, sometimes under the movement of sanctioned owners, and sometimes the vessels themselves are also sanctioned, but they are often short on insurance, they are short on regulatory compliance, they are short on safety compliance, they're short on environmental compliance. And so the shadow fleet presents a growing threat to the global economy, the global rule of law, and the global marine environment. And so the sanctioned vessels that are being targeted largely have some degree of concern either at a national level, so a unilateral sanction, a regional level, so an EU sanction, or an international level, which would be a UN sanction. So these vessels all have compliance issues, they all have security and safety issues. And so what Washington seems to be targeting now are those that are most obviously operating outside the norms and principles of maritime commerce. Now, interfering with freedom of navigation is a serious matter, and so it has to be done very carefully. Now, if you interfere with the freedom of navigation of a fully functional operating ship engaged in international maritime commerce, you run the risk of a lot of blowback, economic blowback and political blowback. But in this case, what seems to be happening is that the so-called blockade, which gives me a little bit of heartburn as a lawyer because it is a technical term under the laws of naval warfare, but the blockage of vessels moving in and out of Venezuela seems to be focused on these vessels that have other deficiencies legally, therefore are much more easily targeted and legally justified.
Yeah, Ian, from September's double strike that killed survivors in the Caribbean to pushing ahead with these Venezuela sanctions despite regional leaders saying, no, don't do it, is the United States then risking its credibility in Latin America as a credible partner? And what does this say about its respect for international rules?
credibility is very much on the line. And I think we have to distinguish the strikes against the vessels that have resulted in the deaths of over 100 people. The legality of those attacks is very much in question. The secondary strikes are almost unquestionably illegal. And so we have to be careful not to blur those incidents, which seem to be on a shaky legal basis at best, versus the sanctions enforcement that now seems to be occurring under this new blockage. Those are two different things. However, the lack of clarity on what the legal basis for all of these operations is brings all kinds of questions to the front, and it does undermine potentially the credibility of the United States with regional partners in the Caribbean and Latin America, but also around the world. And when you start to interrupt with freedom of navigation or start to use force against vessels in one place, it brings up questions on what can be done elsewhere. And so there's also a what we call tu quoque problem, a you also. If the United States is doing it, so too could other states, China, Russia, Iran, other states that are under sanctions, like North Korea. And the question becomes, where is the legal grounding for all of these operations? And that has to be clearly articulated such that everyone can understand it and be able to make the distinctions between what is a lawful use of force, what is a lawful use of interdiction, versus what seems to be a targeted political operation.
And another question that's being asked is the risk of miscalculation, because we've seen tanker chases and seizures. I wonder what worry you the most, with repeated interceptions. Just how real is the risk of an accident or a miscalculation escalating into a serious incident?
Well, any kind of boarding brings with it a lot of risks. There's risks of loss of life and of catastrophic environmental harm. And so we have to be very concerned because, as we noted, first of all, over 100 people have already been killed. So risk to human life in this overall operation has obviously been extreme. On the sanctioned tanker boardings, there is concern, though, because first of all, we've noted that they are not the safest of vessels in the first place. And so interrupting their voyage and potentially using force to board them could result in some kind of incident involving safety, whether it be an explosion because of a failure to deal with the oxygenation of the vessel's oil tanks, or a catastrophic spill. And in the Caribbean, the risk to a catastrophic spill is huge for all of the states because the water essentially circulates. And so some of these are very large crude carriers. It would mean millions of barrels potentially spilling into the Caribbean and actually circulating around the basin. And so this is a huge potential loss, not only to the lives of those on board, but to potentially loss of income and access to food for coastal communities that are reliant on artisanal fishing operations and, of course, coastal tourism. So there are lots of different risks. The U.S. Navy and U.S. Coast Guard are both typically very careful, especially the Coast Guard in conducting boarding operations, which they are very expert in doing and do frequently. But we are seeing activities that are outside the norm. As we said, the blowing up of boats is not a normal counter-narcotics operation. And so we have to be a little bit concerned that something could go wrong. And when you have force being used towards vessels, there's concern as well that force may be used in response. And so that raises also the risk that some of the oil tankers may see a blurred line between what's happening to them versus the smaller craft that were being blown out of the water over the last several months, and therefore may prepare for an interaction that involves exchange of gunfire, exchange of weapons. And that is certainly a very dangerous perspective to have going into what seems to be a longer-term operation.
Yeah, the risks are real. Thank you so much for all that clarification. Ian Ralby, CEO of IR Consilium, speaking with us from Baltimore, Maryland. Thank you.